There is a sentence that captures nearly 4,000 years of Jewish history with unsettling precision. Rabbi Ken Spiro put it this way: "The higher Jews rise in the diaspora, the lower they fall. The nicer the diaspora seems to be at first, the worse the subsequent reaction against Jews." Ironically, the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism have taken place in countries that were the most accommodating to Jews. It is a disturbing claim, and an accurate one. Throughout history, Jews have repeatedly believed the same thing. This time is different. The rulers are enlightened. The society is tolerant. The laws protect minorities. Education has replaced superstition. And for a while, it always seems true. Jews rise. They contribute. They prosper. They integrate. And then something changes. This is not a story of one country, or one century, or one ideology. It is a pattern that appears across civilizations: ancient Egypt, medieval Spain, Enlightenment Europe, modern Germany, and Arab lands in the 20th century. Different cultures, different religions, different languages. Same outcome. This pattern is uncomfortable because it challenges a deeply held belief that anti-Semitism is a deviation from normal human behavior. Jewish history suggests otherwise. Anti-Semitism does not appear when Jews fail. It appears when Jews succeed, but lack sovereignty. When Jews rise without power, visibility without control, influence without protection, they become vulnerable. The mistake is not Jewish success. The mistake is believing success in the diaspora equals safety. The diaspora always offers opportunity. What it never offers is permanence. Every generation has reasons to hope. Egypt had Joseph. Spain had philosophy, medicine, poetry. Germany had universities, culture, law. Arab lands had ancient Jewish communities older than Islam itself. Each time, Jews said, "We are essential here. We are respected here. We belong here." History answered differently. In every diaspora society, Jews share one fatal condition. They are a successful minority without ultimate authority. They rely on rulers, laws, and public opinion, none of which they control. And when economic stress, political chaos, or social anxiety arrives, that reliance collapses. Israel does not end anti-Semitism, but it breaks the pattern. For the first time in history, Jews control their own defense, Jews decide their own immigration, and Jews are no longer guests. That is the difference between survival and vulnerability. The first time this pattern appears is not in medieval Europe. It appears in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, in Egypt, with a man named Joseph. Joseph rises higher than any Jew had before him, second only to Pharaoh, beloved, trusted, essential. And then a new Pharaoh arises, who does not remember Joseph, and the greatest exile in Jewish history begins. The first time Jews believed they had found a permanent home outside their own land. It seemed not only safe, but ideal. It happened in Egypt, not as conquerors, not as outsiders, but as honored guests. And it ended in chains. The story begins with Joseph, the son of Jacob, sold into slavery by his own brothers. Joseph rises through talent, discipline, and moral clarity. In Egypt, he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. He predicts famine. He designs a national economic strategy. And Pharaoh does something extraordinary. He elevates a foreigner. Joseph becomes second only to Pharaoh himself. He governs Egypt's economy. He saves the empire from starvation. He becomes indispensable. For the Jewish family that follows him, Egypt looks like the ultimate success story. Jacob's family settles in Goshen. They multiply, they prosper, they integrate into the economy. They are no longer marginal, they are visible. And visibility without sovereignty is always dangerous. At first, Egypt benefits from Jewish success. Then, it begins to fear it. The Torah introduces one of the most chilling lines in Jewish history. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This does not mean Pharaoh forgot history. It means he reinterpreted it. Joseph was no longer seen as a savior. The Jews were no longer seen as guests. They were now a demographic threat. The Egyptians begin to ask familiar questions. What if these people become too powerful? What if they align with our enemies? What if they outnumber us? This is the turning point. When a successful minority becomes politically frightening, tolerance collapses. Fear replaces gratitude. The solution is simple and ancient. Control the Jews, then exploit them, then demonize them. The Jews are enslaved, their labor is seized, their dignity erased, their humanity denied. The same people who were once welcomed as saviors become objects of suspicion and hatred. This is the first full expression of the pattern Rabbi Ken Spiro describes. Jews are invited in. Jews succeed. Jews become indispensable. Jews become threatening. Jews are crushed. Egypt was not uniquely evil, and that is what makes the pattern repeat. The Jews in Egypt did nothing wrong. They did not rebel. They did not seek power. They did not undermine society. They simply thrived. And thriving without sovereignty is interpreted as intrusion. Joseph had power, but the Jews did not. They relied on one ruler's goodwill. When that ruler died, everything vanished. That is the central vulnerability of diaspora life. Security is always conditional. Slavery was not only punishment, it was containment. Forced labor reduced Jewish economic independence. Harsh treatment reduced Jewish morale. Infanticide reduced Jewish numbers. The goal was not justice. It was neutralization. Egypt becomes more than a place. It becomes a warning encoded into Jewish consciousness. The Exodus story is retold every year, not as ancient history, but as instruction. Remember what happens when Jews believe the diaspora is permanent? Egypt teaches that acceptance can be revoked. Success invites fear. Gratitude turns into resentment. Power without sovereignty is an illusion. This is not theology, it is political reality. What makes Egypt extraordinary is not that it happened. What makes it extraordinary is that it happened first. Every major Jewish exile will follow this same arc, with different costumes, languages, and ideologies. But the structure remains. Egypt was comfortable, prosperous, advanced. The Jews had every reason to believe they were safe. That is what made the fall so catastrophic. The Exodus is not remembered because of miracles. It is remembered because of mechanics. It explains how societies turn. It explains why Jews must never confuse tolerance with permanence. Thousands of years later, Jews would once again believe they had found a golden age. This time, not in the ancient world, but in medieval Europe, in a place remembered for poetry, medicine, philosophy, and tolerance. A place called Spain. If Egypt was the first illusion, Spain was the most seductive. For centuries, Jewish life in medieval Spain looked like the exception to history. It was prosperous, cultured, creative. Jews were not merely tolerated, they were celebrated. And that is precisely why what followed was so devastating. Under Muslim rule in medieval Spain, Jews experienced what many believed was proof that coexistence could work. They became physicians to kings, poets and philosophers, translators of Greek knowledge into Europe, statesmen, financiers, astronomers. Jewish thought flourished. Hebrew poetry reached new heights. Jewish philosophy engaged the wider world. For the first time since antiquity, Jews believed they were not merely surviving, they were thriving. From this success, Jews drew a conclusion that would echo for centuries. We are essential here. We belong here. This society needs us. Spain seemed to confirm the hope that integration could be permanent. But history was only waiting. As political power shifted and Christian kingdoms reconquered Spain, the environment slowly changed. The Jews did not disappear. They adapted. They converted outwardly when pressured. They remained influential economically. They continued to rise. And their rise triggered something ancient. Once again, Jews became visible, successful, and resented. They were accused of manipulating kings, undermining Christian society, corrupting morals. The language changed. The mechanism did not. Many Jews converted to Christianity to survive. They became conversos, new Christians. But conversion did not bring safety. It brought suspicion. The question was no longer what Jews believed, but who they were. Anti-Semitism evolved. It became racial. Conversion could not cleanse it. In 1478, the Spanish Inquisition was established, not to police belief, but to hunt identity. Families were investigated, neighbors informed. Fear became institutionalized. Jewish success was now framed as conspiracy. The more Jews had contributed, the more threatening they appeared. Then came the final act. In 1492, the same year Spain celebrated national unification and global expansion, the Jews were expelled. All Jews were ordered to convert, flee, or die. Centuries of contribution ended overnight. Property seized, lives destroyed, communities erased. Spain rid itself of the very people who helped build its greatness. Spain completed the arc. Welcome, prosperity, integration, resentment. And then, ultimately, expulsion. And once again, the backlash was worst where the acceptance had been deepest. Benzion Netanyahu, the father of the Prime Minister of Israel, studied Spain obsessively. His conclusion was stark. The Jews were not expelled despite their success. They were expelled because of it. Success without sovereignty does not earn protection. It earns envy. After Spain, Jews scattered across Europe and the Ottoman world. Many carried the lesson with them. Many did not. They believed Spain was an anomaly. They believed the next place would be different. Every generation wants to believe it has escaped history. Spain's Jews believed culture would save them. Education would save them. Utility would save them. None of it did. Spain proves that anti-Semitism does not require barbarism. It can arise in sophisticated societies, in educated elites, in golden ages. That is what makes it so dangerous. The expulsion of 1492 was not the end of the story. It was the rehearsal. The same illusion would return, this time in the heart of Europe, with universities, with law, with enlightenment. and with consequences far greater than exile. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe made a new promise to the Jews. It was more generous than Spain had ever been, more rational, more scientific, more confident. It was called emancipation, and it would lead to the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history. If Egypt was the first illusion and Spain the most beautiful, then Europe was the most convincing. No ancient empire, no medieval superstition. This was modernity, law, science, universities, constitutions, and for the Jews of Europe, it seemed, at last, that history had been defeated. Beginning in the late 18th century, Europe offered Jews something unprecedented. Not tolerance, equality. Jews were granted citizenship, allowed into universities, freed from ghettos, invited into professional life. The message was clear: become like us, and you will belong. Many Jews accepted eagerly. They changed names, they changed dress, they changed language. They believed the Jewish problem had finally been solved. And once again, Jews did what they have always done when given opportunity. They excelled. In Germany and Austria, Jews became scientists, doctors, lawyers, philosophers, composers, and industrialists. In France, Jews were patriots. In Vienna, they were cultural leaders. In Berlin, they were intellectual innovators. No diaspora had ever looked this safe. By the early 20th century, many Jews no longer thought of themselves as a separate people. They were Germans of Jewish faith. French citizens first, Jews second. Intermarriage increased, synagogues emptied. Jewish nationalism was mocked as backward. Zionism was dismissed as unnecessary. Why leave paradise? And yet, beneath the surface, something was stirring. Economic change, national humiliation, rapid modernization. Europe was anxious, and anxious societies look for explanations. Once again, Jews were too visible, too successful, too influential, too different, despite all efforts to be the same. This time, anti-Semitism wore a new mask. It called itself racial science, nationalism, and social Darwinism. Jews were no longer accused of killing God. They were accused of corrupting nations. Conversion no longer mattered. Patriotism no longer mattered. Jewishness itself became the crime. No country illustrates Rabbi Ken Spiro's quote more starkly than Germany. German Jews were among the most assimilated in the world. They fought for Germany in World War I. They wrote its music. They built its universities. They believed they were indispensable. They were wrong. After World War I, Germany was shattered. Defeat, economic collapse, humiliation. And once again, the question emerged: who is to blame? Jews, visible, urban, successful, with a perfect answer. Anti-Semitism was no longer fringe. It became policy. What followed was not spontaneous hatred. It was organized, bureaucratic, industrial. Laws first, exclusion next, then deportation, and finally, extermination. 6 million Jews were murdered, not in chaos, but in order. This was the ultimate expression of the diaspora illusion collapsing. The most educated society in Europe committed the greatest crime in history. The Holocaust destroyed forever the belief that Enlightenment alone could save the Jews. Germany had everything Jews were told to trust: culture, law, education. and it still turned on them, not despite Jewish success, but in reaction to it. Europe teaches the most painful lesson of all. The nicer the diaspora seems, the more devastating the collapse. German Jews did not flee because they believed in Germany. They stayed because they believed in it. That belief cost them everything. The Holocaust was not a medieval relapse. It was the logical end of a pattern. A successful minority without sovereignty becomes a symbol of everything a failing society resents. When the camps were liberated, survivors emerged with nowhere to go. Europe was soaked in Jewish blood. The illusion was dead. For the first time, a critical mass of Jews understood. The diaspora does not fail sometimes, it fails eventually. Out of the ruins of Europe came a transformation. No more pleading, no more faith in others' goodwill. Jewish survival would require Jewish control, and that control would have a name: Israel. But Europe was not the only place Jews were forced to leave. In the mid-20th century, nearly 1 million Jews lived across the Arab world. They had ancient roots, deep integration, and they too believed they belonged. Until they didn't. When people speak about Jewish exile, they often think only of Europe. But for nearly 1,000 years, a majority of the world's Jews lived not in Europe, but across the Arab and Muslim world. In Baghdad, in Cairo, in Damascus, in Fez, in Sana'a. These were not recent immigrants, these were ancient communities, many older than Islam itself. And for a time, they believed they had found stability. Under Islamic rule, Jews were classified as dhimmi, protected but subordinate. They could live, they could work, they could worship, but never as equals. They paid special taxes, they accepted legal inferiority, they lived at the mercy of rulers. It was not equality, it was conditional tolerance. And once again, Jews adapted. In many Arab lands, Jews prospered. They became merchants, artisans, financiers, and advisors to rulers. In Iraq, Jewish life stretched back to the Babylonian exile. In Egypt, Jews were integral to commerce and administration. In Morocco and Tunisia, Jewish culture thrived for centuries. The pattern seemed familiar: integration, utility, relative calm. And once again, Jews drew the same conclusion: we belong here. The 20th century changed everything. Arab nationalism rose, European colonialism receded. The Middle East reorganized itself around identity and power. And into this volatile mix came a single catalytic event: the re-emergence of Jewish sovereignty. When Israel declared independence in 1948, it did more than create a new state. It shattered the old order. Jews were no longer powerless, and that fact was intolerable to surrounding societies. Across the Arab world, Jews who had lived peacefully for generations were suddenly redefined, not as neighbors, but as enemies. Almost overnight, Jews were fired from jobs, stripped of citizenship, arrested, harassed, and attacked. Riots erupted, synagogues burned, homes were seized, businesses confiscated. The message was unmistakable. Your safety was conditional, and that condition is gone. Between 1948 and the early 1970s, nearly 1 million Jews were expelled or forced to flee Arab countries. They left behind homes, property, wealth, and history. They were refugees, but unlike others, they were not absorbed by international agencies. They were absorbed by Israel. Once again, Rabbi Ken Spiro's pattern played out with brutal clarity. Jews were welcomed when powerless. They prospered under tolerance. They became vulnerable when politics shifted. And they were expelled when they no longer fit the narrative. The more integrated they had been, the more total the rupture. The expulsion of Jews from Arab lands is rarely discussed because it complicates simple stories. It reveals that Jewish displacement was not one-sided, that Jewish refugees existed and still exist, and that Israel was not merely a political project. It was a rescue operation. Israel absorbed these Jews with no international aid, no global sympathy, no expectation of return. They arrived poor, traumatized, dispossessed, and they built lives. Once again, Jewish sovereignty proved decisive. Arab Jews believed ancient roots would protect them. They believed loyalty would protect them. They believed coexistence would endure. History answered the same way it always had. The Arab world confirmed what Europe had already proven. The diaspora does not end in peace. It ends when political winds shift, and political winds always shift. If the diaspora always fails, if tolerance always proves temporary, if success always breeds backlash, then the question is no longer historical, it is existential. What is the alternative? And why does Israel represent not ideology, but survival? By now, the pattern should be unmistakable. Across time, across continents, across civilizations. Whenever Jews believed the diaspora had finally worked, history intervened. Not once, not twice, but every time. Egypt welcomed the Jews. They prospered. They became indispensable. Then fear replaced gratitude, and they were enslaved. Spain embraced Jewish brilliance. Jews shaped its culture, science, and economy. Then success became suspicion, and they were expelled. Europe emancipated the Jews, educated them, integrated them. Then modern anti-Semitism rose and culminated in the Holocaust. The Arab world housed ancient Jewish communities, centuries old. Then Jewish sovereignty returned, and Jews were expelled almost overnight.
Different eras.
Different ideologies. Same result. Rabbi Ken Spiro's insight is not mystical, it is historical. The higher Jews rise without sovereignty, the harder they fall. Because success without control is perceived as threat. A successful minority always becomes a target when society is under stress. And Jews have been the most visible, successful minority in history. Every generation of Jews believed they had escaped history. They trusted Enlightenment, law, culture, education, and economic integration. And every generation was eventually betrayed by those very institutions, not because they were evil, but because they were human. Anti-Semitism does not require ignorance, it thrives in educated societies. It does not require poverty, it thrives amid prosperity. It does not require religion, it thrives in secular ideologies. That is why it is so persistent, and why Jews cannot rely on goodwill alone. The diaspora always shares the same weakness. Jews succeed, but do not control the ultimate levers of power. They depend on rulers, on public opinion, on legal systems they do not command. When those systems fracture, Jews pay the price. That is not paranoia, that is history. Israel does not end anti-Semitism, but it ends Jewish helplessness. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews control their own borders. Jews control their own defense. Jews decide who enters and who leaves. And Jews are no longer guests in history. This changes everything. The diaspora runs on sympathy. Israel runs on sovereignty. Sympathy disappears in crisis. Sovereignty does not. That is the difference between exile and home. Today, anti-Semitism once again surges most aggressively in societies that claim to be the most tolerant. The pattern has not changed, only the language has. Jews are no longer accused of killing Christ. They are accused of controlling systems, of corrupting nations, of being too successful. History is repeating itself, exactly as it always has. Israel is not a rejection of the world, it is a correction of history. It is the Jewish answer to 4,000 years of evidence. Not the Jews must isolate themselves, but the Jews must never again be powerless. The diaspora will always offer opportunity. It will never offer permanence. That is the lesson Egypt taught, that Spain confirmed, that Europe burned into memory, that the Arab world repeated. Israel exists because Jews learned, finally, to listen. The story of the Jewish people is not one of wandering by choice. It is one of survival under pressure. Israel is not perfection. It is necessity. And after centuries of rising and falling in lands that were never truly home, the Jewish people reclaimed one that is, not because history allowed it, but because history demanded it. Thank you for listening.